What's up, everybody? Axe Wizard here, working on my game some more. It's was Thanksgiving weekend, and then I was also sick, so it took me a few days to get over that. But I've been working a lot on my game, mostly just learning the Godot engine and experimenting, trying to recreate the functionality that I had in GameMaker Studio. Now, the format of this series before had been like every line of code I type, you guys get to see me do it, and you guys get to see me logic it out live, and I would sort of trim out the boring parts, and then it would, I'd put a video, and some people like that, and I wanted to keep doing that. However, when I'm learning this new engine, it would be just many hours of just me reading documentation. Nobody wants to watch that. So, I think until I get the port of the current progress moved over to Godot, and I'm at a point where I'm like comparably where I left off in GameMaker, the format of these is going to be me just sort of recapping what I've done, sort of like just a developer update. And I think that's the best way to approach this as I'm learning Godot, because some of the things I'm doing here I'm probably going to change. So let's just jump in, and I can go in the code and explain what I've got. So let me just jump in and run the game, and you can see what I've got so far. So again, I'm flying around space. That's nothing new. You might notice I've got weapons mounted to my ship again, and I can fire those weapons. So currently these weapons don't do anything. They don't, I don't even have the red projectile being fired because I'm still working on all that stuff, but the way I'm doing it, I think, should work. So first thing that I did, the big thing, is I got rid of my ship, and I moved it to a class. So you can see I've got a folder here called classes, and I've got a ship, a weapon, and a projectile. So we're looking at our ship class right now, and this is all the code that was in my actual ship scene that I had in the last episode. Now, I've done some fun things here. So I added, I'm not even using this right now, so just ignore weapons count, but I added a variable for weapons. And then what I did was, in my code here, it's the same thing as it was before. We're checking input, we're rotating the ship. I got lots of good comments here as I was figuring out vector math, which is fun. And, we're applying our velocity, we're moving our ship. And then I'm getting firing input. So this code block, I'm saying if action is pressed, and I mapped a action to fire primary weapon. I thought about having this as left mouse button like I did in GameMaker Studio 2, but I was thinking, it's probably better to do like spaceship or a space bar to fire, since I think the mouse should be used for just like clicking and selecting, and that way you can view details about other ships without actually accidentally shooting at them as you select them. So and I can implement some system where you can do your own custom keybinds later. So I wasn't too worried about that. So I set that to be spacebar. So fire primary weapon just translates to spacebar. So I've got a to-do on here to make sure that we're not doing this every call, but basically what I'm doing is I'm doing this function called get weapons, which is what I made here, and this returns an array. And so we're preparing our output, and we're getting all of the children of ourself. Now this get all children, this is a function that I found that I kind of made that takes in a node, it returns an array, and it prepares the output again. It iterates through recursively and append any child node. So what that means recursively is, it goes for n in node, get children. So if we look at, say, ship node, so let's go to ships, ship 1. The only child that would actually show up is this sprite child. And that's not what we want. We want all children, including your children of children. So what that script was doing is it's going through, and like if the current child that we're working on has a child count greater than 0, then we also want to append that, and then append all children of that one. And this function is calling itself. which is a recursive function. So that was fun to figure out. Not ideal way of doing it, but because of how I have it set up currently, to where if you look at my ship, here we have the ship type, which is of type ship. If you go to my script, it's actually just referencing the class script of ship. So if we go back to my scene editor here, we go back to ship, you can see that there's some script variables here that I exported. So if you go back to our script, you can see I have these export in front of my various variables. So I can set these in my script editor or my node editor here, and I can create, I can sort of copy and paste this, change my sprite, change where the weapon slots are put on the ship. You can see here I've got weapon slots that are just tacked onto this ship right now. That was me experimenting with it. So I've got a bunch of different weapon slots, which if you look at weapon slot, so if we go to weapon slot here, this is just it's just a type node 2D. This one's a little bit weird. I might make this a class 2, but I don't know. And the script that we have attached to this one, we're just basically doing kind of what we did in GameMaker, where we have a slot type, light, medium, or heavy. And this is kind of a janky workaround that I did, but we need a way to assign the weapon we wish to use for this slot. Only way I can think of doing this currently is using the resource path. So here under my file explorer here, you can see I've got some weapons. So I've got light cannon, which it is just a type weapon, which is another class I made. We'll get into that in a minute, and it has a sprite node attached to it. And my medium cannon, same thing. It's a type weapon. And you can see over here that I have these script variables that I set, and I can basically create these prefabs in a way where I can, all weapons are standard thing that do pretty much the same thing. They just fire a projectile. They might have ammunition. They might have a cooldown. So I can put all of those things into a single class, and that's what I do. So in the weapon slot, we're basically getting what weapon we want to use, and that's sort of pointing to our scene that we made, which is kind of like prefabs and other engines. So that's how I'm working with that currently. I don't know if that's the best way or not, but it's working, and I can make it work. So I'm going to keep going with it for now. So and then I have a variable here that I just initialized to just 0 value. I just declare what type I want it to be, and I just leave it. And then what we do is that when this is called to the scene for the first time, so in our ready function, I'm attempting to load the resource path. So if we don't have a path, return it and just do nothing. But if we do have a path, then we attempt to load that resource path, which gives us a packed resource type, and then we instance that type, and that gives us a instance of weapon. And we make sure that this instance is valid just before we try to do anything with it, or else our game will crash. And then we add it to our scene, so we append it to our self. I don't think we need self in front of this, but I just add it because I saw it in some code, and I like being explicit so you can see what exactly we're adding it to, but it might just be implied that we're adding it to ourself. That's fine. So yeah, so that's what we're doing. And then weapon. So let's take a look at weapon. So we have a class name weapon. So again, I've got a bunch of things that are exported so we can set these in the node editor thing. So if we go to like light cannon here, this is a weapon. You can see we have all these script variables, weapon type, weapon cooldown, and those are all set here. And I like how it makes it formatted nicely. So weapon type is like, capital letters, and it doesn't look like it does here. So that's a pretty cool Godot feature. But I can just set these here on what I want this to be, whether it's a fixed weapon or not. I guess I don't really need to set what the current fire counter is. I think I might get rid of that, actually. We might move this down. So, boom, I'll cut that out, and then what I'll do is, before the code bugs, save, there we go. So now we no longer have that weapon, that fire counter, because every weapon should be ready to fire, and then when you fire it, we set that fire counter to equal what the weapon cooldown is. So this is the time in seconds that the weapon takes between to fire. So I got everything documented here with comments, which is fantastic. So yeah. So we're sort of doing a lot of the same stuff that we were doing in GameMaker before, where we have our, we're tracking what type of weapon we have, whether it's primary, secondary, or independent firing weapon. We're keeping track of the weapon cooldown. We're seeing if it's fixed or a turret style weapon. And then we're determining how much damage this weapon does. And also I added the ability to have ammunition, which I didn't do in GameMaker. So this is a cool thing I'm going to go with. And then, of course, we're just making sure that we can load that projectile resource. Because before we would specify, we had a bunch of like macro constants in GameMaker that would specify what projectile we wanted to fire. Well, I don't know of a great way of doing that currently, and I don't know if that's the best way. So again, I'm just making this work. So we're using the projectile resource path, and the cool thing about that is, you see I have light cannon projectile here. I can right click this and I can go copy path, and I can just copy and paste it right here, and that works. Problem is that you working with paths is very, very brittle, because if I change the structure of my code, I have to go in here and update all these projectile paths, because I don't think it does that for me. So that's one downside to doing it this way, is it's pretty brittle. But I don't know of a better way of doing it currently. So I also have a counter that keeps track of the weapon cooldown. And then I have a function here, which is a method that can be called to fire the weapon. And we take two arguments here. We take the type of weapon, because again, the weapon types were primary, secondary, and independent. Primary was left click in GameMaker, and then secondary was right click. Well, primary is now spacebar. I don't know what I'm going to make secondary yet, but if I'm firing a primary weapon, I also don't want to fire secondary weapons. So, in my ship code, I'm just checking if we should be firing primary weapons. And since a lot of the code to fire a weapon is the same thing, I didn't want to just make three separate functions that are the same thing. So I just added an argument so we can include what type of weapon we want to fire. And we're iterating through all of our weapons. And if the weapon is a primary weapon, it will fire if it's able to. So let's go back to weapon here. So yeah, I made sure to comment this very well as well. Fire weapon takes the desired type of weapon to fire, as well as the current inertia of the ship for more realistic trajectory. Remember, we did that in one of the episodes for GameMaker, is that, if we're drifting through space sideways, Tokyo drift style, and we're shooting a bullet, we want to also kind of take into effect our trajectory. We don't want to just kind of go like this. It looks really weird. So I also accounted for that as well, but thankfully vector math makes that pretty easy. So I take the type that we want to fire, and also take the current inertia of the ship, and we just go through here. We just simply check, hey, is the type our current weapon type? If not, do nothing, just return early. Do we even have any ammo to fire? If not, return early. Are we still on cooldown? If we are, just return early. Everything else we should be okay to fire. I like this approach where I return early, because I don't have to indent a bunch, because especially with the sort of Python syntax style, indenting gets really, really messy. So I like to keep it as not indented as possible. So returning early in this case works just fine for these self-contained functions. So I like doing that. So we are loading the projectile path here. We're also just tacking on instance after, which I could probably consolidate lines in, I think in my weapon slot code. I might do that later. And of course, we're verifying that we have a valid instance. And then So this is a fun thing I had to do to make the projectile work. Is I'm doing git node, which is probably not the best thing to do because again I'm referencing a path which is brittle. I was trying to work with signals, but I didn't really have a great way to connect the signals to, you know, a bunch of weapons that may or may not exist. So that's a fun problem that I worked around. And so once we get the node of where we're going to create it, we're adding the child. We're adding a child of the instance of that projectile we made. Once we add that projectile to the scene, we were setting some variables here. I tried setting this before, but it didn't quite work right. So I set it after, and it seems to work. So I'm setting the direction, which is a variable that I made on my projectile. So if we go to my projectile class, you can see I've got some exported vars for the types, and then I've got these variables which are set by the fire weapon function. So we're going to get into this in just a second. Let's go back to the weapon code here. So I'm setting the direction to use global transform .get rotation. I was just trying to use like rotation before, but because this light cannon is a child of weapon slot, which is a child of the sprite, which is a child of the ship, it kept giving like the relative rotation, which is 0 because it's not rotated any differently than our ship. And rather than trying to do something shoddy like get node and get the ship, which if I change my ship structure, then I have to redo all this stuff. So rather than doing that brittle convention of doing it, I found that you can just use global transform and you can get rotation from that. And so that was really helpful. And I also have to set our projectile's position, our global position, not our relative position, because most everything we've done is relative to the scene. So if I didn't set this stuff, what would happen is that if my ship is firing, it would actually fire the projectile just fine. But if I rotated, the projectile would also rotate while it was firing, and that looked really weird. So this sort of, we make it a child of the main scene as opposed to not a child of us. So it's not affected by any of the rotation that we're doing. And we're just setting the direction variable, and we're also setting its built-in position. And then we're also setting our ship's inertia, which we pass in from the argument here. And then we're handling our fire counter, we're resetting that, and then we're decreasing our ammo. So yeah, that's the fire weapon. And then in my process delta here, I'm just decrementing my counter and making sure that weapon's ready to fire. So let's look at the projectile code here. So you can see we've got the magnitude, which is basically how far this projectile should travel in a second. Again, vectors, direction and magnitude. I love it. And I have the expiration, how long this projectile will last in seconds. So I just sort of set this to be, if we go to light cannon projectile here, I just set the expiration to be 2. And I set the magnitude to be 900. Which is about what it was in GameMaker. So it was, I think in GameMaker I had the speed set to 15, and if you do, you know, roughly 60 step events per second, it was traveling about 900 pixels per second. So I just set it to 900 here. It looks like it looks just like it did it in GameMaker as far as I can tell, which is nice. So in our process function here, you know, we're always taking in the delta. This is a built-in method of the node 2D. So we're decrementing our expiration, and we're taking into account delta just like we did before. And we're just simply checking if it's set to expire. If it is, then this is the Godot equivalent of instance destroy. We're just we're just safely freeing this instance from the queue, or we're queuing this instance to be freed from the tree, which means that we're just getting rid of it. We're dropping it. But queue free does a few things behind the scenes to make sure it's done safely. So I don't quite know what it does yet, but that's what people seem to be using. So I'm using it there as well. So then we also need to, so if we're not expired yet, then we're going to calculate where we are going to be. So what we're doing here is I'm just doing something similar I did before, where I'm setting a vector 2 to be 1, 0, which is an arrow facing to the right, which is a normalized vector. And then I'm also rotating it by what our direction is in radians. And then I'm multiplying it by our magnitude and delta, which gives the, so again, vector, direction, and magnitude. That sets us to where we're going. So if our ship is facing here, and we're supposed to be traveling, 900 pixels a second, that this magnitude times delta gives us that broken down in the time elapsed since last frame. So that's how that works. And then I'm also just simply adding the ship's inertia to that current vector. So if we're like floating up, but we're firing this way, when we shoot our bullet, the ship's drifting here, the bullet's also going to have that upward drift too. So it's gonna carry on. It looks much more realistic, and it allows you to aim a lot better. And I think it's what would happen in real life too. I could be wrong, but I like it that way. And then from here, I'm just basically translating myself. So since I'm just using a standard node 2D, I'm not doing any physics process. I don't need to apply a force to it or anything, because I don't want it to necessarily physics collide with stuff. I don't want it to bounce off of things necessarily. I mean, that could be something cool to have or add later, but in my current state of what I want right now, that's not the desired behavior. So I'm just sort of translating it by our current velocity, which we are just we're keeping track of. So, and then we're also rotating the sprite that we have as well, attached to our projectile. So that's it. So that took me many hours to figure out, but I'm at the point now where I'm feeling better with Godot. I'm understanding it more, and now that I've figured out how sort of classes work and I've got something cobbled together, I can continue to refine and iterate upon this. And yeah, I'm pretty happy with how it's going. I mean, part of me is frustrated because it's slow at this point, because it's always a learning curve when you're learning a new engine. But at the same time, I'm enjoying myself immensely exploring this engine and just figuring out these problems, and I'm liking it so far. The only thing I'm not sold on Godot is node communication. And that could be a big thing. With GameMaker, it was super easy because you can just there's collision events and stuff like that give you the ID of the other object, and you can find IDs of other objects really easy. But because in Godot everything is Lego parts, it's really hard to find the actual Lego part that defines what the whole Lego piece is. And so the way that Godot wants you to do it is that you can do something like this, where you're getting, hey, sprite. So I'm getting this sprite node because it's called sprite. It's a child. So I can simply call that down the tree. So if I am the parent and I'm trying to manage my children, I can just call them by their name. And these are relative paths that work fine. But if you are a child, you should only be focused on what you're focused on doing. If you need to pass something up the tree, you need to do that using signals. But the problem is you have to connect the signals. So I'll give you one example of a big problem I faced for my ship. I wanted to have a weapons array, and I wanted to have, I was okay. Well, anytime a weapon slot ends up creating a weapon, because sometimes you might buy a ship that has 4 weapon slots, but it only comes with 2 cannons. You got to buy your own weapons for it. It might not have a weapon yet, and you can also swap those weapons out. So I was like, okay, well, maybe I can just emit a signal when I add a weapon. But the problem is I have to connect every signal to a specific function for that specific node. And if I'm doing a bunch of these prefabs here of, different ships, some ships might have 2 weapons, some ships might have 5 weapons, some ships might have 20. I don't have a great way of doing that, and it doesn't. I don't see a way that I can just connect a signal just by a name to a function that does a thing. Like, I have to connect it to an actual node as well, or else it'll just be ignored. And that seems pretty short-sighted, to be honest. So I feel like I'm just using I feel like my project structure just isn't how Godot wants it. So I've been looking at tutorials and stuff like that, trying to figure it out. And for what I'm trying to do, I don't really see a great way of doing this. Like, this weapon slot kind of throws a wrench in the works, because it's kind of like an intermediary. But you need to have a weapon slot in order to put a weapon in it. So I'm not sure conceptually how I would change that, but yeah, that's what I've got so far. There's not really much to show as far as the game. It's still same old, same old. I'm flying around, I'm shooting. Cool. I haven't. Next I'll be, programming how to actually deal damage to ships, and then I can start. Now that I've got something working, I can work more on trying to get the rest of the systems working. So, for example, next big thing is dealing damage to ships, and so I'm gonna explore that. That'll be pretty fun. I'm sure I'm gonna have to add some more nodes to this, like a add child node. I'll probably need something like a area 2D and a collision shape to that. And that should let me detect collisions without actually having physics collisions where, like, it stops and stuff like that. So being able to do all that stuff will be pretty fun. I think how I'm going to have to do it is when I create a ship, I think I'm going to have to add the ship to a group called ships. And then when I collide with that, I can just see if it's part of that group. But so there's a lot of things that I'm just not sure about, so I want to get that working. And then once I get something ironed out and I have this all iterated on and I'm happy with it, then I can start fleshing out the rest of these prefabs to add in all these other, I have this whole sprites folder here. So I have all these different ships to add. So I can sort of just go into my ships here, and I can copy paste ship 1, ship 2, ship 3, ship 4, blah blah, and I can set all these script variables for them and make them all how I want them, and place all the weapon slots where they need to go on the ship, and that way I'm not having to calculate it by hand like I was doing in GameMaker. So it's going pretty well. I feel like there's some problems that I'm running into that I don't know if I'm solving them in the best way, but I'm keeping my eye out. And so far, I'm just enjoying this journey in Godot, and I'm having fun. The one downside I would say is that GameMaker, I think, has been around for a lot longer. So there's a lot more, like when I go Google something, there's a lot more forum posts, there's a lot more Reddit posts, there's a lot more YouTube tutorial videos covering it. With Godot, I'm finding it's a lot less resources available in terms of, like, when I'm Googling my problems. And maybe that's just because I'm coming from GameMaker, so I'm Googling like I would GameMaker, and Godot is an entirely different thought process. So I'm just taking it day by day and just learning how to think in Godot. And then I think I'm coming along. So progress. So this is that slow point. So I think the next few episodes are just going to be not really me coding on screen, but more of just me giving you an update on what I've learned and what the progress of the game is. And then once the game is caught up to where I was in GameMaker and I'm feeling pretty fluent in Godot, then we'll go back to the old style way where you're seeing me do this live. I'm problem solving it and in real time, and you get to see me make all the mistakes and change things 6 times again, all that stuff. So anyway, that's the progress on Godot. Thank you so much for watching, and it'll probably be another few days for the next episode for this. These are all there's gonna be much slower pace, and I've got a lot of other content I want to make right now as well. Paladins has been really fun. Godot, learning Godot has been taking up a lot of my time, and then also Valheim has a new update coming out soon that I need to be ready for. So, and I've been started playing God of War, which is taking a backseat to all this other stuff. But yeah, I'm having a blast. But thank you all so much for watching and your comments and support. Comment below if you have any ideas or resources to share with me with Godot. If you are a Godot developer, I'm definitely interested to hear it. Anyway, thank you all for watching. I'll see you in the next episode.